Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we look back at the truly massive, world-altering conflicts of the 20th century, our minds almost instinctively go straight to physical combat. But today we're going to flip that script a bit. We're going to explore how the most critical battlefields of those eras weren't actually fought with bullets at all, but with information. We're diving deep into the architecture of public persuasion. Let's just start right here. Put yourself in the shoes of an everyday, ordinary person living back in 1917, or maybe 1942. You probably weren't sitting around in your living room reading elite military strategy, right? You understood the world wars almost exclusively through the information your government handed you. And here is the kicker. Governments fully, 100% understood that. Naturally, when we think of these wars today, it's completely normal to picture physical weapons first. Muddy trenches, heavy tanks rolling across fields, bombers completely darkening the sky, and millions of soldiers clashing on the front lines. That is the visceral, traditional image of war we all know. But that traditional image kind of masks the real paradigm shift of the era. While physical warfare was absolutely happening with bullets and tanks, the ultimate battlefield was actually psychological. It was being fought right at home, in newspapers, inside movie theaters, on radio broadcasts, and even on street posters. As industrialization sparked new technologies and literacy spread like wildfire, governments gained this unprecedented, almost unbelievable ability to influence how millions of people understood reality itself. Okay, Section 1. The invisible battlefield. Let's look at exactly why the psychological shift was so incredibly crucial to the overall war effort. Governments at the time quickly realized a hard truth. Modern war required vastly more than just sending armies to a front line. It required entire, massive societies to be totally mobilized. They needed their populations to fiercely believe in the cause, sacrifice their personal comfort, obey wartime directives without question, and actively participate in the war machine. Without that deep psychological buy-in, the physical war would simply collapse. Which brings us to Section 2. What is total war? This is the foundational idea tying all of this historical analysis together. So, in a total war, conflicts are no longer just these isolated clashes between professional armies fighting in some distant field. The entire population is suddenly part of the war effort. The traditional line that history always drew between a combat soldier and an everyday civilian, it completely blurs. Everyone is involved now, whether they're wearing a military uniform or not. Everyday civilians were suddenly working around the clock in munitions factories. They were strictly rationing their daily food, spending their hard-earned money on war bonds, and meticulously conserving basic resources like rubber and metal. Governments absolutely needed this deep level of cooperation to keep the war effort breathing, especially as casualties tragically climbed into the millions. They literally needed mothers to send their sons off to fight and workers to accept severe shortages without rioting. But how on earth did they achieve that level of cooperation? Well, that brings us to Section 3, Rethinking Propaganda, and why it was about a lot more than just telling lies. Historians really push us to think carefully about this concept. When you hear the word propaganda, what comes to mind? Does it simply mean fake information? A lot of folks hear that word and automatically assume it just means creating a fake reality entirely out of thin air, just pure, fabricated lies. But historically speaking, the reality is way more complex. Propaganda was actually this highly potent, carefully calculated recipe. It usually mixed a little bit of actual truth, a ton of raw emotion, very selective facts, deep patriotism, and some very real fear. The goal wasn't necessarily to invent a fake reality from scratch. It was to masterfully shape how people interpreted the reality they were already living in. And historians actually debate a truly fascinating point here. Were governments creating concepts like fierce nationalism and racism out of nowhere, just manipulating the public from above like puppets? Or were they simply amplifying and weaponizing prejudices that were already deeply rooted within the soil of that society? It's a subtle distinction for sure, but an absolutely vital one when we're analyzing how mass persuasion actually takes hold. That leads us right into another major misconception that historians love to challenge. When we think of wartime propaganda, it is so easy to immediately picture the extreme dictatorships of the era, like Nazi Germany or Fascist Italy. But was propaganda really only used by dictatorships? Actually, no. The crucial takeaway here is that heavy media manipulation was practically universal. You have democratic societies sitting right next to authoritarian regimes on this front. The United States, Britain, and France relied heavily on mass media to manage public opinion and maintain morale, just exactly like Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union did. Now, obviously, their political systems and the extremes of their methods differed wildly, but the underlying need to completely mobilize society, that was shared across all the major powers.
Okay, let's move to Section 4, normalizing extreme violence. This is, without a doubt, one of the darkest themes of the 20th century.
This progression right here shows the truly terrifying power of mass persuasion. First, propaganda teaches a society to view an enemy not just as a competitor, but as a dangerous existential threat, or even as racially inferior. Once that psychological groundwork is locked in, the second step naturally follows. Extreme violence seamlessly becomes justified in the public's mind. And that brings us to the horrific third step, where entire societies can be led to tolerate unimaginable atrocities like mass civilian bombings, internment camps, and ultimately genocide. The information literally paves the way for the physical reality. Meanwhile, all of this intense global messaging was creating some incredibly awkward situations on the world stage. That brings us to Section 5, the colonial contradiction and the exposed hypocrisy of the major powers. Picture this. During the wars, European powers proudly broadcasted to the entire world that they were valiantly fighting for democracy, liberty, and freedom. Yet, colonized peoples across the globe were watching these exact same broadcasts and noticing a rather glaring contradiction. These very same European powers were still actively ruling over vast colonial empires, denying basic freedom to millions with an iron fist. That hypocrisy became a massive catalyst. It drove anti-colonial leaders across the globe to start asking a simple yet completely explosive question. If freedom and self-determination matter so much in Europe, why not everywhere else? That single, undeniable question, born directly out of wartime messaging, would eventually spark the movements that completely reshaped the world map. As we wrap up, we hit Section 6, reading the modern world. So why does all this 20th century history even matter to you today? Well, because the world wars didn't just redraw borders on a map. They fundamentally rewired how governments communicate, how mass mobilization works, and how ordinary people actually experience politics. They laid the literal historical foundation for the modern media-driven political world we all navigate every single day through our TVs and smartphones. And that is exactly why developing a critical eye is so incredibly essential. Whether you're digging into historical documents and Perusall for this unit, or just scrolling through media on your phone today, you have to move beyond just asking if something is factually true or false. You need to use this analytical toolkit. Ask yourself, who actually created this message? Who is their specific target audience? What deep-seated fears or hopes are they trying to trigger in me? And critically, what perspective is completely left out of the frame? I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to consider, taken directly from our source material. Information is never neutral. As you continue your learning, really ask yourself, how is your society persuading you right now? Because ultimately, understanding how you are persuaded is just as critical as understanding how wars are fought. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those deep questions.